Hello, everyone. Welcome to this final discussion session for the course. To begin with, I can take any general questions if you have uh, about any aspect of the course. Then we'll move on to the lectures. Abhishek?
Uh, Sir, my question is related to the radio emission. You mentioned that there are ordinary and extraordinary mode which occurs in and the magnetosphere. Are they same as the orthogonal modes discussed in emission? That there are orthogonal modes. Are they same?
Okay,
Deepak,
before we address this, are there any general questions? Because then we'll get to course questions immediately after that.
yeah, okay. Yeah, if there are any first general questions. So there will be a final assignment and a quiz for the last module that will be hopefully be available by tomorrow. And you'll have about a week or so to finish that. But the rest of the general announcements regarding the course, I can make it towards the end so that there are more people who can join by then. But if there are any general questions you might have about the course, you can ask now. Okay, if not, I think we can go to the questions related to the lectures.
So we can start with Abhishek's question. I have already mentioned that when you look at the radio emission, you see these two distinct polarization modes. And the idea of ordinary and extraordinary modes is an attempt to explain that phenomenon. You have two orthogonal modes of propagation, two modes of orthogonal polarization propagate through the plasma, and at any one time, one of them dominate. So you get that polarization or the other polarization. So that's where the importance of ordinary and extraordinary modes come. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
But Deepankar, does it mean the medium decides which one will dominate?
No, medium doesn't have to decide, but it is the modes already develop at the point where the medium is being excited. When medium is the plasma is the one that is radiating, right?
So, okay. You're referring to the medium, which is the radiator itself.
Radiating medium.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I understand.
Okay, we can go on to the next question. Abhay, you had a few questions in the forum I could see. If you want, you can start asking.
Sir, I have a few questions.
Go ahead.
Would you please explain the ohmic crust heating once again? I didn't understand in the lectures.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
There was a mention of this term ohmic crust heating, and probably
ohmic. Yeah. So if you have if there is a magnetic field, and that magnetic field is generated due to currents flowing in the crust, and the crust has finite resistivity, then these currents will dissipate over time. And as the currents dissipate, the energy goes into heating the crust. So that will cause a heating. So that's the ohmic heating of the crust.
Okay.
Right?
Does that lead to switching off the pulsar? Was that the correct thing as I understood?
No. This is usually a very slow process. it will take some millions of years, over which the magnetic field can show some decline.
Okay, sir. Sir, some other questions are slightly not to the main content of the course. I can ask them later if required.
But you did have a list of questions in the forum.
Yes, sir. It's about a few special cases of pulsars. So, if I may ask now, one thing is about the extragalactic pulsars. So, are they, I read that they are inferred because of the supernovae, and whether they could be bright enough to be seen from our galaxy. That is one question.
We have detected some extragalactic pulsars, but in nearby galaxies, Large Magellanic Cloud and Small Magellanic Cloud. They are typically quite faint, so we haven't yet detected very far away. SKA is going to be hopefully successful in finding a large number of extragalactic pulsars.
Okay. So a few questions related to the pulsar geometry and the beam patterns. So if we are not viewing the pulsar, in the in an angle which is 90 degree to the magnetic axis, if we are viewing that, so do we see the pulsar at all, or we sort of don't see the radiation at all? If our viewing angle,
beam has to point towards you, no?
right?
So if the angle between the spin axis and the magnetic axis is such that the beam that the pulsar is radiating does cross your line of sight somewhere during the spin period, then you will see the pulse. Otherwise, you won't. So it's an interplay between these two angles: angle between the spin axis and magnetic axis, and angle between the spin axis and view axis. So your view axis must cross the radiating cone at least for a part of the period, and then you will see the pulse. If it is completely outside, you will not see.
Okay.
And it doesn't have to be at 90 degrees or anything. Right? This is true for any general angle between these two.
Okay, sir. And I was wondering, like, I was attending some talks on AGN also. So, whether pulsar can heat a nearby gas and dust medium, so that we could actually see the annular ring that can get generated because of the pulsar radiation. Is that a possibility?
There is something called pulsar wind nebula, where you see structures like that. For example, the Crab Nebula, if you zoom in close to the center of the nebula around the pulsar, you see these ring-like structures. You see pulsar wind moving through, and there is a termination shock, and that is a ring-like object. There is Crab's twin in the Large Magellanic Cloud. It's called O540 minus 69.3. That also shows something similar. There are other interesting structures which you can see around the Vela pulsar in X-rays. So yes, when the pulsar wind interacts with the interstellar medium, you get this pulsar wind nebula around it, and that nebula can show structures like this. Typically, if you have a supernova remnant which is confining the pulsar wind, you see them very prominently.
Okay, sir. And sir, there was a mention of something called as anti-pulsars in the Ruderman paper, 1975 paper. So they say that if protons are or the positive ions are not originating from the polar caps, if the polarity is reversed, then you may have anti-pulsars, and that is not something they are considering, and they assume that the magnetic field is anti-parallel to the spin axis. So
yes, in Ruderman-Sutherland models, only those pulsars work, right? Because you need to have a finite gap at the polar cap for Ruderman-Sutherland model to work. And that is possible only if you need a substantially large voltage for charges to be pulled out from the surface. And if ions are bound strongly to the surface, then you can sustain that voltage without filling the gap with plasma very quickly. So if the magnetic axis and the spin axis are parallel to each other, then you will have electrons being pulled out of the surface, and electrons are bound much more loosely. So one expects that it will be filled with space charge and no gap will occur, and therefore the regular pulsar mechanism will not operate. So that is Ruderman-Sutherland model, but it is part of that model. Not all features of that model are necessarily correct. So we have come to know later on that the ions are not really that strongly bound. So whether it is pulsar or anti-pulsars, the charges will be pulled out in any case. And but you will still have potential drop at the polar cap because of general relativity, which I mentioned a couple of times in my lectures earlier. So it doesn't matter whether you have strongly bound ions or not. You will still have a potential drop which can produce enough voltage to keep some level of pair production going near the polar cap. So once you take GR into account, you don't need this special orientation. So therefore, I think that's an early version of the model, which is no longer necessary in the modeling of pulsars.
Okay, sir. All right. Thank you for that.
Did you have other questions, Abhay, or that's about it?
That's all, sir. The other data analysis questions you have answered, so that's all.
You heard something about masers.
Oh yes, sir. I was wondering the terminology maser is used exactly like. I just wanted to understand that generally we say it's an amplified stimulated emission. So here we are considering the relativistic ions as kind of inversion, population inversion. And I mean, I just wanted to get a clarification of the maser term being applied to pulsar.
Maser is a radiation process, right? Where you have dominance of stimulated emission, right?
Right.
So, and that also causes coherence.
Yes.
So, this in typically in laboratory laser physics and so on, you would see lasers and masers are not any different. Just because it is called light in one place and microwave in another place, the mechanism is not different. It is exactly the same. So don't worry too much about the literal meaning of whether it is microwave or light. In case of pulsar, it does happen to be microwave, the radio emission that we're talking about. But the process is that you have a population of particles which can generate radiation. The radiation that is generated can always be interpreted as transition of a radiating particle from a higher energy state to a lower energy state. Now, these energy states could be discrete, which is what you mostly employ in laboratory lasers. But it doesn't have to be. They could also be continuum states. So in continuum states, if you have a population inversion, what one means is that suppose you have a thermal plasma. So in a thermal plasma, you expect the particle energy distribution to follow Boltzmann distribution. So if all particles are described by a single Boltzmann distribution, then that is a thermal emission and there is no population inversion. However, if we have a departure from Boltzmann distribution and at higher energies, you have some additional set of particles over and above what would be expected from Boltzmann distribution, then you have population inversion. And this population inversion can then lead to stimulated emission. And that's what will lead to maser emission. And this is what is referred to in pulsar magnetosphere as well. The particle energy distribution is not thermal there, it is non-thermal. And if you look at it in phase space, then in position momentum space, so in the momentum space, you have particles which are bunched because there are particles, large bunch of particles moving together in a given direction. So momenta are quite similar. So you have congregation of particles in phase space, and then there is empty space, or rather sparsely populated space nearby the particle population. So that creates a situation where the particles can make a transition and produce stimulated emission. And given the right conditions, this can lead to emission generated from one part being amplified by stimulated emission as the radiation moves through the plasma. So that's what is maser referred to in this case. It's a continuum maser with basically driven by the phase space distribution of electron momenta.
Okay, sir. Okay. Yes, sir, that's all for you.
Okay, there's a question in the chat from Jyoti Jwal. And they want to understand how cold catalyzed nuclear matter is created.
Right. So what cold catalyzed nuclear matter means is that you create a distribution of neutrons and protons at a given density, and then allow infinite amount of time for the matter to equilibrate. So it will undergo beta emission, inverse beta decay, all of that. And then at a given density, at a temperature which is absolute zero, you will get a completely defined state which is dependent only on nuclear forces. And if you reach that description of matter composition, you call that a cold catalyzed matter. So that is what is assumed to be in the crust. Although one is not literally talking about infinite time or absolute zero, but the temperatures are much smaller than the typical Fermi energies which are involved. So thermal motions are negligible. Whereas the time scales for transmutation by strong and weak interaction processes are typically much shorter than the ages of neutron stars that we see. So therefore, we can approximate it as infinite lifetime. So one expects that we will have a cold catalyzed matter in that region.
Next question.
Are you talking about Magellanic Clouds? Magellanic Clouds are galaxies. Galaxies contain stars, galaxies contain neutron stars, and some of those neutron stars are pulsars. So just like we live in one galaxy, Magellanic Clouds are other galaxies which are nearby to us. They are smaller than us, but they are galaxies nevertheless. and since they contain stars, they can also contain pulsars.
Was this in your private chat?
Oh, is it a direct message? Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I wasn't sure what the question was.
Yeah, the question was, how does the Magellanic Cloud, what effect do Magellanic Clouds have on pulsars? But Magellanic Clouds are not clouds, as we know it. They are galaxies.
I have a question since we are going for the previous modules as well. Right now, so this is a larger, bigger picture type question. So we have studied different radiation models for different cases. We have seen how refining the models improve certain things. So what we have discussed so far in the class, do they span large enough a fraction of what we have observed, or are there still sufficient outliers where we have no models whatsoever, or some cases related to that? Something where we know for sure these are pulsar, these are neutron star, but they are way out of any model outliers explanation or something.
This is difficult to tell because tomorrow you may always find something which may surprise us.
Yes,
But
that's true.
as far as we know, the main emission mechanisms which appear to operate in all known pulsars were covered in the course.
Okay.
Of course, there are variants and there are subtle changes here and there which you can incorporate. Particularly in radio emission, there could be several other complications which we have not talked about, because that would become far more involved. But there are variants in the general picture. So how does particle bunching take place? Where exactly the bunching takes place? So all those issues are not yet settled in pulsar magnetosphere. You must have got the impression that the radio emission mechanism, we only have qualitative answers at the moment. Pure quantitative, fully quantitative description is yet not there. So there may be other mechanisms which we have not thought about yet. And there have been a few other variants which have been talked about in the literature which I have not covered in the course. But the idea was to give a general background so that if you come across other aspects in the literature, you will have something to relate to, and also to use whatever knowledge you gain from here to apply there.
So it was by and large related to what I was I was diving into. So if I'm analyzing data from pulsars and I see something not following the model, before claiming a new discovery, I should check my code first, because by and large things should behave as we expect.
That you should certainly do first. And then that is a general statement, not just for pulsars. So you must check and absolutely verify your result. And then if something new survives, of course, you always find something new.
Okay. Yeah. If there are less questions, then I would like to make a comment on the course, if I may.
I guess if it's short, we could.
Yeah. So far I have enjoyed the course a lot. Thanks for everyone involved to structureize the code this way. Usually I'm very poor in following online courses. I've tried with Coursera and all, but the way course is structured, plus on top of that how the assignments are spoon-fed, sort of step by step, they allow uh, uh, people like me to follow. That was absolutely amazing. With very little background, I can see how I end up getting the result what is desired. I have never done this with physics courses before. So the assignment team has done a really nice job. Thank you so much. That's one comment I wanted to add.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think that credit goes entirely to Prakash. And this course was not originally meant to be for the uninitiated, but I think he has brought it in the ambit of people who have not had a great deal of experience with pulsars to start with.
Anyway, we can take more feedback towards the end of the meeting, I think. But if there are any more questions related to the lectures, you can raise now.
Yeah, this is an absolutely idiotic question, but since this is the last opportunity of the season, I am asking it. When you talked about nulling, you said it never happens in the middle of a pulse. And then the restarting after that, there are some, what should I say, transient sort of thing in the process of settling into the new whatever pattern, etc. It somehow sounded like you have got a diesel motor which is working and then it runs out of fuel, and then you put in fuel and then you sort of rev it up and it restarts. So there is some difference in noise initially, and then it settles into a steady pattern. In both cases, it is electric motor. Is there an analogy like that?
So analogies can be made at any level, of course. But here, the driving mechanism for everything here is the potential drop, electric field, right? So if you quench the electric field, then the mechanism will stop. And you can restart the electric field. If the electric field starts with a smaller value and then ramps up, then you can see some change in the drift slope, for example, which because it's E cross B drift, and if E, the value of E is not the same, then you will get a different drift rate. So something like that probably is the case, that for some reason you quench it for a little time and then it restarts. The details of the mechanism are still difficult to fully grasp, but whatever you said as an analogy can also be applied, I guess, at some level. Depends on how we want to interpret the analogy. But, so I wouldn't, yeah, go ahead.
This is talking about the electric field and its quenching, etc. But it was mentioned that the magnetic field, on the other hand, can jump across a pulse. Is that correct?
No. Magnetic field is something that is anchored to the neutron star, its own field.
Yeah.
So how would you say it jumps across the pulse? I mean, I didn't understand that.
I remember hearing about, okay, I can only speak about something similar which one read about the solar wind. I mean, the way the polarities change as you go round.
That doesn't happen in the zone of emission of the pulse. No, certainly not for radio.
No, what confused me was the following. It was mentioned that like the electric potential being behind the emission, there were also shortings happening.
That is correct, because once you create plasma, So plasma can redistribute itself, and the electric field due to that can short out the existing electric field. Yes.
And it was also mentioned that there can be field lines of opposite polarities and field reconnections taking place.
That is not in the radio emission region. That is in the wind, far
Okay.
out of the light. So we talked about that in the context of high energy emission.
Oh, okay.
So it's a striped twin model, for example, where see, if you take magnetic dipole field and then rotate it and then go beyond the light cylinder, then as the wind propagates, then it's a propagating wind, right? So over one period, the wind propagates that distance, c times the period. And and it's a magnetic field which then undergoes full rotation in that period. So the frozen wind, the magnetic field frozen in the wind over that distance has one full cycle. So it changes polarity in between. It's a toroidal field. So toroidal field in the wind will change polarity with a pitch equal to c times the period.
Yeah.
Right. So, so that is in the wind zone. And part of the high energy emission, as we have talked about, is becoming increasingly plausible that a good fraction of the emission comes from that zone, just outside the light cylinder.
Okay.
So there all
this
these
part
things are
is
possible.
Okay, okay. So these are like shortings of the magnetic field happening.
Yeah, so some fraction of the magnetic field can reconnect, particularly the poloidal component, which will stick out of the wind equatorial plane. They can come close and then they can reconnect, which is a small fraction of the total field. But those reconnections can then accelerate plasma and you can create pairs. Yeah.
Okay, because that
But
was
energy of all of that comes from the rotation of the pulsar. The generation of this toroidal field comes because the pulsar is rotating.
Yeah.
So this is not coming at the cost of the magnetic energy of the pulsar.
Okay. Another question is regarding bulk Comptonization. In the case of when you were explaining this lasing action, you're talking about bunching in phase space, and so the thermal. It sounded, I mean, for that bunching to take place, the thermal motion of the particles involved should be much smaller than the directed motion of the particles, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is in pulsar magnetosphere. The bulk gamma is much larger than the random motion.
And that is where the bulk Comptonized part comes from. The outcome.
We talk about bulk Comptonization. This is so Comptonization can happen in the gaps wherever there are fast particles which are being accelerated. They can Comptonize existing radiation, and the radiation can then be boosted, and they can produce further pairs and so on. So yes, so Comptonization does have a role in producing high energy gamma rays and also sustaining pair production. But Comptonization is not thought to play a role in radio emission. Whereas the major mechanism that we are talking about is primarily for radio emission.
So since you mentioned this process, there was a mystery about Crab pulsar producing very high energy gamma rays, right? 10 to the many times tera electron volt energies.
Yes.
Maybe going to
Yes.
2 orders of magnitude higher than that. So is this process that you just mentioned, quantization, is possible explanation, because they didn't have initial energies acceleration that can ever produce this naturally till something else was done.
Yes, that is correct. So you need to have very, very high energy particles, which will need to you will need for this kind of quantization. So bulk quantization is possible. And now that one has a zone where you can feed energy into particles from magnetic reconnection and not necessarily from polar cap voltage drop, we can possibly have very fast particles being generated there as well. And quantization from that can produce high energy emission. So most of the very high energy emission models which people are doing now are mainly from acceleration in that region. But I wouldn't say that all the physics is fully captured in that. Some of it is assumed. So one still has some way to go to understand the very highest end of the energy, radiation energy distribution from Crab.
Yeah, thanks.
And this is the reason why pulse shapes varies quite a bit when you go towards the highest energy regions.
At the highest energy, pulse shape is not that variable actually. From time to time, if you look at the pulse shape of any pulsar in X-rays or gamma rays, they don't change so much. But they tend to be quite different from the pulse shape in radio. In fact, Crab is a relative exception, where you have radio pulse coming almost close in phase with gamma rays. For most other pulsars, the gamma ray pulse shape and the radio pulse shape are quite different. But as a function of time, we have not seen the high energy pulse shapes vary so much. It's more commonly seen in radio. You have one mode or another mode. That there are many examples of that in radio. For some time, we have one pulse shape, and then the pulse shape changes into another mode and then switches back to the other mode. So that is seen more commonly in radio. It's not seen that much in X-rays or gamma rays.
Okay.
Sir, I have a question related to superfluidity. What we learned basic of superfluidity, that if a liquid helium is there in the beaker, then it will sort of come out of the side of the beaker. It has that cohesive movement. And you said that for rotation to be maintained, there have to be vortices in the superfluid. So my question is, does the gravity of the pulsar affect the superfluid motion, and how does it affect?
gravity affects superfluid like any fluid. I mean, it's nothing special that the superfluid has to do with gravity, right? But
Your vortex,
when you try to make it move, like rotate, so then the superfluid will act as a macroscopic quantum state, and you try to move all the same way, and you cannot sustain a bulk rotation in a superfluid. It will break up into individual vortex lines.
okay, so the vortex lines stay fixed in the space, but I mean, a given vortex line is not shifting, spinning around the spin axis. Is that correct, sir? A given
The
vortex.
material, the vortex line is a topological entity, right?
Okay.
So you have a core of the vortex line which does not have superfluid. So that is a discontinuity. And once you create that discontinuity, superfluid can spin around that vortex line. And the vortex line in principle can be parallel to the spin axis of the pulsar. So the superfluid will have angular momentum which spins around this quantum vortex line. And there are many such quantum vortex lines. And when you add up all that angular momentum, then the net angular momentum is along the spin axis of the pulsar, and it also adds up to the total angular momentum of the superfluid.
Okay, sir, but in a reference frame which is outside the pulsar, the vortex lines themselves don't rotate along with the pulsar. They remain fixed in the space. Is that correct? Or they also rotate?
No, they don't keep, no, they don't have to remain fixed in space. The vortex lines, as I have mentioned already, they either pinned to the crust or they are dragged along by electromagnetic drag through the electrons along with the crust. So they rotate along with the body of the neutron, rotate along with the crust.
Okay, sir.
But the vortex lines may be not fixed in the superfluid frame. So lines could be moving through the superfluid. Superfluid need not be, overall angular velocity of the superfluid need not be the same as the angular velocity of the crust of the neutron star. And this difference in angular speed creates a force on the vortex line. It's called a Magnus force. And that force pushes the vortex lines either outwards or inwards, depending on the sign of this excess velocity. Is it, if it is moving slower, it moves, vortex line will move inward. If it is moving faster, if the superfluid is moving faster, then the vortex line will move outwards. So now the density of vortex lines decides the angular speed of the superfluid. So if the superfluid is moving faster, then there will be a force on the vortex lines to spread out so that the net angular velocity of the superfluid can catch up with the angular velocity of the crust. If it's the other way around, then the vortex lines will try to move in. So again, equalize the two angular velocities. But the vortex lines need not be stationary in the frame of the superfluid.
Okay, sir. Yeah.
This you know also with regular fluid, right? If you have a vortex, the vortex can move with respect to the fluid.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I just was wondering whether it has some kind of a gravity defying movement as we see in a beaker, that it has a phenomenon of crowding on the walls of the beaker in case of liquid helium. So whether such thing is observed and whether it sort of doesn't care about the gravity of the pulsar itself, that is what I was wondering.
Now, liquid helium also cares about the gravity of the Earth. So gravity affects everything equally.
As a bulk, yes, but it has a tendency to crawl on the wall of the beaker, isn't it, sir? I mean, I had read it somewhere.
No, I mean, if you keep pouring liquid helium, it will not climb out by itself unless there is a surface tension. So you have to force it out of the beaker.
Okay.
So there has to be a force which will pull it out.
Yeah, I'm not asking that question, but I'm trying to see if I can provide another word for what he's trying to ask. Is there an equivalent of buoyancy here? The vortices.
Yes, absolutely there is an equivalent of buoyancy. Vortices, for example, the interior of the vortices are less dense than the outside superfluid, and all the vortices are buoyant. They feel a buoyancy force. And buoyancy force is due to gravity. Without gravity, there would be no buoyancy.
Okay, sir. All right.
Maybe since we are coming to the close to the end of the hour, we can also take some feedback for that participants want to give. So, I mean, you can, of course, interrupt and ask a question anytime. But also, if you would like to give some feedback about the course, you can give it now. We'll have a more formal feedback form that will be mailed to you once the course is completely over. So and it will have an option of giving anonymous feedback as well.
Sir, it's been very interesting program, and quite unexpectedly, one has gotten to learn about the exciting world of pulsars and so many physical processes that are going on there, and some of them were quite counterintuitive. And I would like to also express a vote of thanks to the whole Pulsar team and yourself for bringing us this whole program. So I look forward to studying this further and interacting with the Pulsar group.
Thanks, Abhay. As part of the TLC, we would really like to know if there are things that we could be doing to improve the way we are connecting and the way you're learning things online, especially for an advanced course such as this. So if you have any ideas that you think it can be implemented and would help you learn, that would be helpful to us. Abhishek, you
Prakash, you have
had something?
a regular questionnaire as well?
Yeah, we do. We'll be sending it out later.
I just have one suggestion, because in such situation, such level of planning and execution is very difficult in itself. But if we had a breakout room discussion session, dedicated discussion session with other participants, that would be much better, because over chat there is still a limitation that what we can discuss how much we can discuss. So that's just one suggestion that I have. The rest is everything is fantastic and wonderfully planned. uh, Actually, the assignments, the quiz, and everything is very well planned, looking at such situation, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks,
That's a
Abhishek. I think
very
it's,
good suggestion. I think Prakash, we can take it on board.
yeah, I think we could create some sort of groups or something even that is changing over the course of the sessions where they can discuss among themselves and work together. Yeah, that's a very good idea. Thanks, Abhishek. Other questions or comments?
I shouldn't be commenting at all because I've been attending only in a haphazard fashion. But thanks for telling this complex story, putting it into some sort of order so that it becomes comprehensible at least. So that is an amazing effort, making sense out of something which is so complex and setting it out in such logical.
Complexity is inevitable in this kind of situation, and hopefully some of the course participants will get involved in unraveling some more of this complexity.
So thanks a lot. And the questions were enjoyable. I mean, students were asking some nice questions, and
Yes.
they were very illuminating questions in the sense of, see, all the kinds of new things which can, kind of problems which one can think of in this context. I mean, it's already quite a problematic thing, understanding this phenomenon, details of the phenomenon. But thank you for the course, and thanks all the participants also for all their nice questions, which I'm not a student, so I enjoyed your questions. I should tell this to the students and thank them too. And
thank you for attending and participating. I think it was quite enjoyable discussing with you too.
Thanks to Prakash also, and Desh, and Ratnashri was there in the beginning. So
yes,
it's also
we are
very
missing her today.
Sushan also in between, she contributed nicely.
Sushan is there today.
Thanks, Indulekha.
There was one question actually. One was listening to a talk on the emission from main sequence stars, their magnetospheres. The magnetic fields are, in the case of the pulsar, it is a frozen field. And in the case of the Earth or a star, it is a dynamo generated field. How does that influence this type of periodic emission from one and the other, or does it have an influence?
No, so perhaps you were talking about the kind of work that Barnali has been doing.
Correct.
So there she's taking strongly magnetized main sequence stars like AM or AP stars of that category, where there is a strong dipole field. It could be dynamo generated, but it is still fixed. It's not the fields like the low mass stars like the sun, where they're very small scale. The sun also has a fixed dipole field, but of much smaller magnitude. But here the dipole field is very strong. And because there is a fixed geometry of the dipole field, you still get structure, emission structure, which is shaped by that field, and that's how you get a periodic emission. The emission mechanism there that they're seeing is electron cyclotron maser.
What about white dwarfs?
Yes, white dwarfs also produce this kind of, so there is a class of white dwarfs which are called white dwarf pulsars, which have magnetospheric emission, again largely dominated by electron cyclotron maser.
So this could be more ubiquitous than just with neutron stars.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you also see this in brown dwarfs. You see this in planets. I mean, Jupiter does this.
I was going to ask about.
Yeah. So actually, the Earth does this as well. You can, if you are looking at the Earth from a distance, you can look at the radio emission and then find the period of the Earth, spin period of the Earth. That wavelength is in kilometers. It's called auroral kilometric radiation. So you can build a detector sitting on another planet and observe the Earth and find its spin period. So it's a quite ubiquitous. The basic mechanism of magnetically directed radiation, which then reveals the spin of the object, is quite ubiquitous, not just for neutron stars.
Except an external observer is going to be heavily confused by the man-made other, range of radiation.
Yes.
While they would have understood this, the basic stuff that you just mentioned, they would not understand how it's also accompanied by this huge amount of radiation at other wavelengths.
Very different, yes. Hopefully, we are not making that much of kilometric radiation. So, if you stick to kilometers wavelength, then I think you will get a relatively clean spectrum.
Yeah, right. No, in fact, I think, and that's the radiation that one needs to worry about for all the space probes trying to work at very low frequencies. This is a radiation they cannot avoid.
Exactly.
But the kilometric radiation would not propagate very far, would they? Because of the plasma frequency, it would be below the plasma frequency, wouldn't it?
Plasma frequency of interplanetary
ISM.
No, we are not going to ISM. We're talking about satellites around the Earth.
Oh, okay.
Maybe from the moon.
We are past the time, so if there are no questions, Desh, you wanted to say something?
No. I was just about to say the ISM plasma frequency is typically a few kilohertz.
Right.
So thank you all, and I think it has been enjoyable for me to interact with you as well. And if you do have any further pertinent questions, do keep in touch. You can write to me. As and when I get time, I'll try to address them. And, thanks to Prakash for enormous amount of effort to go from the original lectures to the way the course is now. And I think that's what really made the difference. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a word of thanks from me as well, Dipankar. Thanks for making the time. And thanks a lot to Prakash, who has done a wonderful job, and all of you participants who have been with the course for over 2 months now. And Prakash is going to send out a questionnaire. But I think, whatever inputs you've given is heartening to us. But we would like to we keep trying different things because just to enhance the learning processes. And we would like to assess how effective we have been in the different ways we have tried to do things. And clearly, giving assignments and regularly is something which has helped from whatever you have said so far. And also the suggestion of having discussion rooms, etc., is an excellent one. But if any other suggestions you might have for us at TLC to keep improving, don't hesitate to contact us. And as Dipankar said, as far as pulsars are concerned, feel free to contact him as well, directly. Thanks very much to all of you, and particularly Dipankar and Prakash.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, I was really impressed by the number of participants who stuck till the end. This was good. Even if you missed a few lectures or quizzes here and there, you decided to be in the discussion and listen to all the discussions. I think that takes a lot of commitment. I'm really impressed by the number of people who stuck till the end. Originally, I did not think so many people would stick till the end. So that was really good. Of course, I would like to thank Dipankar a lot for initially giving the lectures a few years back, then agreeing to do this online course again. And I really look forward to working with him more and expand on this. And as we discussed in a few of these discussion sessions, if this takes a form of a book or any other material, I would really like to work on that as well. And I'll also like to thank the colleagues at TLC and IUCA who indirectly and directly helped run this course and make it run very smoothly, including the people at in our computer center. So, in the future, I still have goals for this course in terms of expanding it so that there are a lot more hands-on exercises, so that one can listen to these lectures and also get some experience working on various things, no matter it's theoretical derivations or working with the data, or even hopefully numerical simulations of some simple kind. That I think that would be really good. I plan to work on it, and hopefully in the future I can make such material available to go with this course and expand it more. So I really hope you all enjoyed this course, and any future expansion to this course, you would be interested in attending those as well. I'll just make a few comments about the course, the logistics of the course as it ends. There will be a final assignment and a quiz for the last module this week. And after the due date, in about a few days, you should be able to see your total scores. And I'll send out an email detailing all the things that I'm saying right now about the course, but also additional things such as criteria for certificates and things like that. And we'll try to keep this course page open for a month or two from any final due date, so that you can come and look at the course material if you're interested. And the lectures will, of course, be available publicly in the NRC IUCA course YouTube page if you want to ever access it and go through the material. So it has been a very good experience working on this course and working with all the participants here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much. Particularly Prakash, Desh, Ratnashri in absentia, and all of you. And of course, Sykes for overseeing it all. So thank you very much.
Can I just remind before it's too late?
Yeah, I know you want to remind. Yes, go ahead.
A wonderful book on pulsars by Kal, Aaj aur Kal.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to that.
We'll certainly keep that in mind, yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
That's the sole reason for my not wanting to miss this session today.
Yeah, we will definitely seriously get on to that. So, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone. Any questions, you can always direct it to nrciuca@gmail.com. And since the course portal is open, you can still post questions in the discussion forum till the course is available for a month or so. Thanks. Bye.